This is Designing the Revolution. It's chapter 29, The Revolution After the Revolution, part 2. Okay, so in the last episode we were talking about this political crisis, political conflict, crisis management, what happens when it all starts going to shit, how do you deal with all this external pressure from the bad guys, international capital, United States, dare I say it, no disrespect, and all that sort of stuff. And all the internal disappointment, you said you were going to have a wonderful revolution and, we're all poor and miserable and all this sort of stuff. So what we were saying was, you have a Citizens Assembly that creates new legitimacy for, people being objectively poorer, as it were. And you have this dialogical sort of culture and move. And these are powerful, right? No guarantees, but these are the new moves. Looking more broadly in terms of the strategy, in some ways that you might call those sort of tactical moves, the strategy, the deeper strategy is to move away from this conception of politics as a sort of zero-sum game of, you get richer and you get voted for, or people go poorer and you don't get voted for, this really reductive materialism. And what we want to start exploring, I would suggest, is how do revolutions historically survive, those that are successful? What is the cultural transformation that takes place? And I'd like to suggest is the big structural move here is to move towards what I would call, you might want to call it something else, but I would call post-materialism. In other words, people aren't interested, they're still interested in stuff, right? People like stuff, there's no big, that goes without saying, but they're not just interested in stuff, or even they're primarily interested in something else, values, culture, and such like. So why does this happen? Well, it should come as no surprise because we've already discussed the biggest problem with revolutionary episodes is that by definition times where there's no money, right? One of the main reasons of the revolution in the first place is because there was no money and people are poor and they've made a mess of it and there's been massive corruption and the climate crisis is destroying crops and it's just a total mess. And great, you come into power and you've got all this mess to sort out and it's not going to get any easier because you've got all these people opposed to you and trying to sabotage you and all the rest of it. So it goes without saying that revolutions that survive have to shift the collective ego away from, hang on a minute, I haven't got that much stuff, to non-material values. So non-material values, let's take a few sort of stabs at this. The biggest move, obviously, is towards some form of patriotism. So patriotism or nationalism, belief in the fatherland, we've discussed this a bit, you can have progressive forms of it, but often it's rather nasty. But what you can't deny is it's post-materialist. It doesn't matter that I'm poorer because I'm supporting our country, and our country is important, and if I need to be poorer, so be it, and all this sort of stuff. And then you usually have some sort of revolutionary values, liberty, equality. These things aren't primarily materials. You're not necessarily getting richer, but you've got some political rights. You haven't got the priesthood telling you what to believe. You're feeling freer, you feel more equal, and you're a lot poorer. But it doesn't matter because you've got these revolutionary values. And then you're moving away, towards a more virtue ethics orientation. What's the point of my life? Is it to get stuff and get a mortgage and have a nice house and career? No, it's more like what's good, what's a good person? What is it to be a good revolutionary? And you get coming, these ideas of honour and duty, and it's not what it is for me. This sort of selfless non-materiality. Now, I'm not necessarily saying, this is good or bad. What I'm saying is that sociologically, it's a no-brainer that if you're going to have a functional social system in the post-revolutionary period, then you're obviously going to have these post-material values. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to collapse, and often it does, of course. And the twist in the 21st century, of course, is You've got the classical dynamic of everyone becoming poorer, which I've just talked about. And on top of that, you've got this total shit show of the climate collapsing and everyone by definition become poorer because crops are failing and the world economic systems collapsing and all the rest of it. So you've got that as well. All right. So the task is not to be in denial. This is the first point, right? It's absolutely pointless going into a revolution with a program that's going to make everyone richer. I'm going to come to this more in a minute, but that's fundamentally like self-sabotaging. The revolutionary message beforehand, in so much as you need to organise like expectations, and afterwards has to be a progressive, non-materialist meta worldview, for want of a better way of putting it. What does this mean? So again, it means we're here to support the revolution. That means it's not about you anymore. It's about the country. It's about the revolution. It's about these progressive values. It's about creating a sociability society. In other words, it's a question of duty to do this. It's a question of honour. So these words, duty and honour, in our horizontalist, materialist, individualist last 30 years, they're associated with this fuddy-duddy old style stuff. I'm suggesting these notions come back in and they're not intrinsically reactionary, right? Lots of revolutions talk about honour and duty, and it's because we're all coming together and we've got responsibilities to each other and all this stuff. And interestingly enough, this is one of the ways, of course, the revolution is successful, because it appeals to values that conservative people can get their head around. And so this is how you build the construction of the people in a left populist sort of way. And related to this is the notion of service and the notion of sacrifice, like similar ideas. But you notice that they're post-materialist values, right? It's not about getting stuff. It's like, what can I do for the community? What can I do for the country? What can I do for revolution? What can I do for people in the global south, in solidarity with other revolutions and what have you? I'm in service. I will step down, if the Citizens Assembly wants me to from my position and blah, blah, blah. And I'm here to sacrifice. If I need to take a pay cut, so be it, because, this big social project is worthwhile. Okay, so that obviously manifests itself through various social events and social institutions that have to be built through this revolutionary process. So there needs to be a focus. One of the ways in which post-materialist values start to manifest themselves is a focus on the local, the family, the neighbourhood, the community, and the re-establishment of fraternity. As I said, in the French Revolution, the notions of friendship, the notions of sociability that we've been looking at in some detail. So this might be manifested in people going to other people's houses, having meals, local community events. In other words, people's, rigid, individualist, materialist, I'm in my bedsit, I don't need to think about anyone else. That's got to go. It's going to go anyway because people are going to be forced to cooperate. But what we need to do is to evolve this in a pro-social way. So how this might manifest itself in a sort of dynamical sort of way is, look, you've got this social movement. We've been talking about this. This social movement triggers, a social revolution, the change of the regime. The social movement after the revolution doesn't go, oh yeah, that's all cool. We can go back to watching Netflix or whatever. It's like going, no, right, our purpose now is to make those social formations within the social movement, spread those through society. So, for instance, you have your social movement and they're going to decide what the policies are, in an assembly, and then that's going to move out into the local community and people are going to say, God, it's not very good, this revolution, it's lost us loads of money, we've lost our jobs, it's really shit. And what the social movement is going to say, yeah, it's not good. Let's have an assembly to see what we can do in the local community to respond to this situation. Is it the revolution's fault, or is it just because it's a climate and, all these people that are trying to do us in and all the rest of it. What can we positively do? Maybe we're going to have these community projects, the community allotments, community gardens, all this sort of thing. And I read something the other day about, what was it? Saunas, right? Saunas in Finland. So apparently Finland's the most happy country in the world. And they were, trying to say, oh, it's because people have saunas. But, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you can see, like, the argument was community comes together, whether it's an occupational community or geographical community, and they're all sitting there, half dressed, as it were, in their sauna, having a chat. And there's this process, a bit like a meal, that facilitates this dialogical sociability dynamic, which undoubtedly improves social well-being, right? So, mental health and all the rest of it. So it doesn't matter that you're not going to, Mallorca for your holidays. It doesn't matter that you haven't got a massive pension. You're making new friends, basically, all that sort of stuff. And this relates to this notion of reconnection with nature, or this patriotism, which is manifested in a sense of rootedness to your local space, your local environment. The physical environment means nature. Now, to be honest with you, a lot of people, this is a big thing for me, I'm used to being an organic farmer, blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is, it's not for everyone, and it won't be for everyone, right? So there has to be a pluralism of post-materialist orientations, right? Some people just are not going to want to do reading, right? Some people will. Other people want to do a local film club. Other people, might want to do a comedy club. There's loads of sociability, ways in which sociability can be manifested within a new social sort of project. But, there we are, there's the nature thing as well. Then there's the cultural thing. So, one of the things I've always been a bit romantic about is pop music in the 1970s, when I was 12, whenever it was, 1978 or something like that. Pop music was a massive, and the reason it was massive was there wasn't actually that much more, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't a big plurality of different cultural forms. And the great thing was in the 1970s, and this is well documented, pop music, popular music, rock music, this had a massive influence on, working class people. Yeah, they were poor, they had shitty jobs, but it's great, cultural form that they found meaning in and could express themselves and say fuck you to the establishment and all the rest of it with punk and all that sort of stuff. Now, for me, that's, that can't be replicated, obviously, because that was situated in that time and place. But the point is culture and art is a massively powerful strategy of dissolving reductive materialism and expanding the human experience into forms of collectivity where people are enjoying themselves because they're doing plays, because they're doing, making stuff, because, they're involved in music and all the rest of it. And lastly, there's religion. Well, religion's, a controversial thing, so it covers a multitude of sins. But sociologically speaking, there's no question that religion is a form of post-materialist culture, right? So there's a plurality of formations of it in the sense that, you can have everyone going back to the Catholic Church at one end, or you can be designing or initiating new religions at the other end. And I'm, potentially going to talk about this in a future episode, so I'm not going to go into great depth here. But it's important whether you might not be religious, but you can't pretend that this isn't a major part of the human experience, and it will continue to be, in the same way as you might be massively into nature, but the fact of the matter is some other people aren't. They might be into Catholicism, for instance. But the idea, in terms of a revolutionary strategy post a revolution, is that all of these elements need to be proactively promoted so that you dissolve this zero-sum game culture of, oh my God, this revolution is rubbish because we've got less stuff and the internet doesn't work properly and all the rest of it. And this then is how is this brought about? Yeah, well, partially these social movements are going to be at the forefront of creating it. But there has to be a moral and cultural and spiritual leadership element to it. In other words, the people who run the country, whether these are the vanguard people, cultural figures, they need to be making the arguments, right? We've discussed arguments on everything, but they are something. And they need to be saying, look, there's more to life than your pay packet. And this needs to be reflected, of course, in the lifestyle of those leader figures or those social influencers. So there's no point like someone saying, hi everyone, all you guys can go to rock festivals, but you're not going to have much money. And then I go off, pay myself, £10 million a year because I started a revolution and go flying around the world. So there's two elements. There's the argument that you're fundamentally moving a lot away from the neoliberal, hey guys, we're going to have a revolution and you're going to earn loads of money. That's like massively self-defeating. And the person that's saying it has to be going, yeah, you don't have to be a saint, but you can't be running around, with your private jet and all that stuff. All right. So I just want to, before we finish this episode, I want to just look at fascism, dare I say it. So I want to look a little bit more at the longer term. A lot of what we've discussed here is, the first year, the first 2 years, maybe the first 3 months, you've got these massive challenges. What are the pro-social ways of not ending up like with Lenin and shooting people and all this stuff? But there's going to be a major competitor as to this pro-social revolutionary project, and that's fascism. And the reason why it's such a strong competitor, paradoxically, is because in some ways it's very similar to the pro-social post-materialist revolutionary project, in the sense that fascism is a post-materialist, an anti-materialist ideology. So often this is not properly understood. And the main reason why the whole neoliberal left is facilitating fascism is because it's so stupid, to be honest with you, it's so stupid to see that the reason why fascism has mass appeal is precisely because it's post-materialist. In other words, what fascism gives people is the dark side of the post-materialist orientation. In other words, a love of domination, hierarchy, a love of scapegoating. In other words, it's saying, look, you can be poor, but, you can submit yourself to this, Hitler figure, Mussolini, all this sort of thing. You can submit yourself to hierarchy. In order, progressive people are a bit like psychologically illiterate in the sense that the reason a strong part of human nature, or at least deep cultural traits, as Eric Fromm said, is a fear of freedom. In other words, you don't want the freedom to become a possessive individualist. You don't want to have to work hard and make loads of money and make all your own decisions. It's lovely, actually, to be told what to do, to have a hierarchy, whether it's a traditional, Catholic religious sort of situation, right-wing situation, or if it's a post-Christian, Nazi situation. Both of these basically are saying you don't need to think, we'll tell you what to do. In other words, like you're dissolving, you've got this post-materialist sort of orientation, and that goes along with a whole bunch of other things, finding meaning in hating people, scapegoating people. It exists, don't be in denial about it. And last but not least, there's the whole notion of the death wish and variations on the theme and Freudian themes that people actually want to die. People don't actually like life. It's too confusing for them. It's too complex, right? And if you think this is, mad, you just, with all due respect, you're just not looking at the historical record. For, just to give one classic example, is at the height of Napoleon, you might have seen this film of Borodino, which is out at the moment, the hubris of the Napoleon project was invading Russia in 1812. And they had this big battle, Borodino, about 70,000 people died, it's massive, horrendous thing. And he had all these French cavalrymen, and they're charging into battle, and they're going, their big battle cry is, let's go and die. I'm not making this up, that's what they said. They said, let's go and die. In other words, it wasn't like, let's go and make loads of money. It's let's go and die, because they were in this manic, cultic sort of psychic space of going, the Napoleon project, the French project, whatever it is, the Republican project, that's what it is. And we don't care whether we're going to, freeze to death in the Russian winter and all the rest of it. So I want to give like an example. I've got this somewhere. Don't know where it is, but I'm going to give this example anyway. Oh yeah. I might have mentioned this in the previous episode, so apologies I'm repeating myself. But something that brought this home to me was there was a Green Party leader in Germany, and he was going to go to the miners. I'm probably simplifying somewhat, but as I understood it, he was going to go to the miners, right? This guy's like a philosopher lecturer, so he's not going to be that cool as far as East German miners are concerned. And he goes to the miners and he says, I'm going to promise you something. Well, first of all, these miners have been let down by everyone, communists, the capitalists, so they're not really going to believe the guy. Number one, he tries to promise something to them. And number two, he says, we're going to have this green revolution and you're going to be okay, right? In other words, he's using the neoliberal frame, which is saying you're going to be okay. You're going to be on the same income. You're going to get another job and it's all going to be fine, right? Number one, he's lying to them. They're not going to be fine. They know they're not going to be fine. First of all, because the neoliberal system doesn't give a shit about them. And secondly, because the climate crisis is going to make everyone poorer, like everyone, because it's going to be, that's the nature of it. You've gone too far. So all that he's going to do is increase the alienation of these miners against the whole system and exacerbate this culture war whereby these miners are going to go, fuck that, we're going to go and vote for, Alternative for Germany, because at least they aren't lying to us, or if they're lying to us, at least they're going to say something that's non-materialist, which makes more sense, i.e., Germany is great and all this sort of stuff, right? So the whole notion of saying we're going to have a revolution, we're going to have a green transformation and everyone's going to be richer is totally stupid. All it's going to do is create fascism, because fascism is going to come in with a far more viable ideology, i.e. a post-materialist one. So, we talked about this having to happen before the revolution, but after the revolution, it's the same idea. That if the leadership and the whole revolutionary project degenerates into a materialist, individualist orientation, it's just shooting itself in the foot. It has to create this vibrant, fun, dare I say it, but non-materialist like culture. It can't be all Calvinist, honour, duty, sacrifice. That's going to be part of it, but it's also going to be, let's go and have some fun. But it's going to be fun without much money, which is fine because you can have loads of fun without much money, dare I say it. And that's going to be like the culture. So that's going to, in the longer term, what we're looking at then is, community events, banquets, music, festivals, religious ceremonies. I've been talking about this a minute ago. And then this is going to be like underpinned by this new democratic culture. So you're not going to have the big man Stalin, right? You're going to have the prophetic source figure, someone like me dare I say it, or, hopefully someone better than me, but someone who doesn't have any power but has some moral authority or spiritual authority, or, is basically a decent person that is charismatic, and they're going to, guide people. So this new model of leadership, which doesn't have formal sort of hierarchical power. Secondly, there's going to be this assembly culture where people are going to say, yeah, we don't think what's going on is great, but we're going to have this dialogical spaces. And then that's going to move into how we organise not just social life, but economic life. I've not talked much about this because, I've only got a limited amount of time. But there's a whole project here there's a whole project here of saying, look, you know, the jobs are going to be pretty shitty, right? Because climate crisis is happening and the jobs aren't going to pay much. But what we can change is the atmosphere and the culture of the workplace itself, so people can participate in how it's constructed within these objective limitations. And, you know, there's going to be set people on the management if it's a big company, and there's a whole literature about it. But the thing we're contributing here is this notion, these dynamics of sociability, that the construction of the workplace is humanized, and that, you know, that's a big subject. Okay, so that's the broad direction of travel. You've got the crisis management bits, you've got the citizens assemblies, you've got the dialogue bit, you've got the culture bit. But really, like, all this has to be consolidated. The other big piece here is, so how the hell is this all going to work formally in terms of formal power? So it's not like the formal power bit is all there is. It's not like the culture dialogical bit is all there is. This is one whole meta strategy, which is all these things working together. So the next episode is really going to look at this hard power problem, which is who makes the decisions after the revolution. Okay, thanks.